Episode 1, Pay Attention.
Like most people, I go to work, do my job, and go home. Nothing unusual about that. I put on my uniform, take over the shift, watch the cameras, make my rounds, and wait for morning. Then I go home and try to sleep. It's a simple life. A repetitive one. The kind of routine that makes weeks disappear before you realize they've passed. Most nights are so similar that if you asked me what happened 3 Tuesdays ago, I probably couldn't tell you. That's why I find it strange that I can remember one particular bus ride home so clearly. What stayed with me wasn't what it meant. It was a much simpler question. How had I missed it? My name is Daniel. I'm a night security guard. The bus ride home was always my time to switch off. It was where I played mobile games, checked messages I'd ignored during work, and decided what I was going to eat when I got home. Most mornings followed the same pattern. But one morning, even the games felt boring. So I started deleting old messages. Bank alerts. Delivery updates. Promotions. The usual clutter. I still had about 30 minutes before the bus reached my stop. So I kept scrolling. Then I stopped. The message was 6 days old. I didn't recognize the number. And I had no memory of seeing the message before. It contained only 2 words. Pay attention. That was it. I opened the conversation. No older messages. No history. Just those 2 words. Out of curiosity, I replied. Who is this? The message stayed where it was. I tried calling. The call ended before it even rang. I searched the number online. Nothing useful appeared. By the time I got home, I was curious. Not concerned. Just curious. Then life moved on. I worked. I slept. The message slipped into the background. 8 days later, another night shift came and went quietly. Around 3 in the morning, I found myself opening the conversation again. I wasn't expecting anything. I was simply curious whether the number would seem familiar now. It didn't. Then my phone vibrated. A new message appeared. Same number. Same conversation. Lights were still on. I stared at it. Then looked at the first message. Pay attention. Lights were still on. For the first time, they felt connected. I replied immediately. What lights? Then. Who are you? The conversation remained unchanged. The rest of the shift passed more slowly than usual. Not because of the message itself. Because I kept thinking about it. Days passed. Then more days. Nothing new arrived. The conversation remained exactly where I'd left it. 2 messages. 2 fragments. No obvious connection between them. Yet I kept opening it. Then, 11 days after the second message, my phone vibrated again. I was halfway through a cup of coffee when it happened. Same number. New message. It was already open. I read it twice. Then looked back at the others. Pay attention. Lights were still on. It was already open. 3 fragments. 3 pieces of something. And for the first time, I stopped wondering whether the messages were connected. They were. The real question was how. Because the more I looked at them, the more they felt like part of a story. And I had a feeling I was only seeing the middle of it.
Episode 2, Don't Use the Front.
The third message changed the way I looked at the first 2. Until then, I treated them as separate incidents. Strange. Unexplained. But separate. After the third message, that became harder to believe. Pay attention. Lights were still on. It was already open. The messages still didn't make sense. But they felt connected. I just couldn't see how. Over the next few days, I tried finding an explanation. I searched the number again. Nothing. I searched parts of the messages. Nothing useful. I even tried entering the number into a few caller identification websites. No results. The number seemed to exist only inside my phone. A few days later, I showed the messages to Adam. We were finishing a shift change when I handed him my phone. He read the 3 messages. Then handed it back. Looks like somebody's messing with you. That had been my first theory too. The problem was that it no longer felt convincing. Why? He asked. I don't know. And that was the truth. I didn't have a better explanation. I just wasn't satisfied with the obvious one anymore. For a while, I considered telling my family. Then I imagined the conversation. 3 strange messages. No threats. No names. No real story. Nothing anyone could actually investigate. The police made even less sense. Nobody had threatened me. Nobody had asked for money. Nobody had committed a crime. I had 3 messages and a growing sense that they mattered. That wasn't enough for a police report. So I did nothing. Or at least, nothing useful. I worked. I slept. I rode the bus home. And every now and then I opened the conversation. Not because I expected a reply. Because I kept thinking there might be another message. That realization annoyed me. But it was true. One night, nearly 2 weeks after the 3rd message, I was sitting alone in the security office. The warehouse was quiet. The parking lot was empty. The camera showed nothing unusual. I checked the conversation once. Then put my phone down. An hour passed. Nothing happened. I started thinking maybe Adam had been right. Maybe whoever sent the messages had gotten bored. Maybe the story ended with those 3 fragments. Then my phone vibrated. I picked it up immediately. Same number. New message. Don't use the front. I read it twice. Then I looked back at the others. Pay attention. Lights were still on. It was already open. Don't use the front. Something had changed. The first 3 messages sounded like observations. This one sounded like advice. Or a warning. For the first time, I stopped thinking about the messages themselves. Instead, I started thinking about the person behind them. Whoever had written the first 3 had been describing something. Whoever wrote the 4th seemed to be talking to someone. The question was, who? Because I was becoming less and less convinced that it was me.
Episode 3, The Silence.
The strange thing about the 4th message wasn't what it said. It was what happened afterward. Nothing. For almost 3 weeks, the conversation didn't change. No new messages appeared. And slowly, the mystery began changing shape. At first, I was relieved. The 4th message had bothered me more than the others. Pay attention. Lights were still on. It was already open. Don't use the front. The first 3 sounded like observations. The 4th sounded personal. Like somebody trying to stop somebody else from making a mistake. Then the messages stopped completely. Life returned to normal. Or close enough. I worked. I slept. I rode the bus home. But every now and then, I opened the conversation. Not because I thought I'd find something new. Because unfinished things bother me. One night, Adam noticed. You still checking those messages? I looked up from my phone. Sometimes. He laughed. That's not what sometimes looks like. I smiled. He wasn't wrong. The messages had become a habit. The same way checking the cameras was a habit. Not important. Just routine. At least that's what I told myself. The silence stretched into a second week. Then a third. And eventually I started believing the messages were over. Maybe Adam had been right. Maybe it really was a prank. Maybe whoever sent them had gotten bored. The explanation wasn't satisfying. But it was possible. One night, shortly after midnight, I found myself going almost an hour without opening the conversation. That hadn't happened in a long time. I remember feeling strangely relieved. As if I was finally moving on. Then my phone vibrated. The sound seemed unusually loud inside the empty office. I looked down. Same number. A new message. I opened it immediately. And frowned. The message wasn't a sentence. It wasn't even a word. It contained only a number followed by a comma. 3. Comma. That was all. Not just the number 3. The number 3 followed by a comma. As if the rest of the message had been cut away. I stared at it for several seconds. Then read it again. Still the same. 3. Comma. Nothing else. I typed a reply. 3 what? No new message followed. I tried again. What does that mean? The conversation remained unchanged. For nearly a minute, I sat there staring at the screen. The earlier messages felt incomplete. This felt broken. There was a difference. I opened the conversation and looked at everything together. Pay attention. Lights were still on. It was already open. Don't use the front. 3. Comma. The new message didn't fit. At least not yet. That was when something occurred to me. A simple thought. One that should have occurred much earlier. What if the messages weren't arriving in the order they were written? I sat back in my chair. Then read them again. This time, not as messages. As fragments. Pieces. The first 4 already felt connected. The 5th felt like part of a sentence that hadn't fully arrived. The more I thought about it, the more reasonable the idea seemed. Maybe the messages weren't confusing. Maybe they were simply out of order. I looked around the security office. The monitors still showed the same empty warehouse. The same empty parking lot. Nothing had changed. Except the mystery. Because for the first time, I wasn't trying to understand the messages themselves. I was trying to understand how they fit together. And if I was right, then somewhere ahead of me were the missing pieces. The beginning. The end. And whatever happened in between.
Episode 4, The Wrong Order.
For the next few days, I couldn't stop thinking about the same question. Not who sent the messages. Not why they were appearing. Just one thing. If they were out of order, what was the correct order? The idea followed me everywhere. During my shifts. On the bus ride home. Even when I was trying to sleep. Every time I looked at the messages, I found myself rearranging them in my head. Pay attention. Lights were still on. It was already open. Don't use the front. 3. Comma. No matter how I arranged them, something was missing. The 5th message still bothered me more than all the others. Because it felt incomplete. Not mysterious. Incomplete. Like the first half of a sentence. 1 week later, another message arrived. The side door. I was on the bus when it happened. The vibration came from my pocket. I looked down immediately. Same number. Same conversation. The side door. I stared at the screen. Then my eyes drifted back to the 4th message. Don't use the front. The side door. For the first time, 2 messages seemed to fit together naturally. Not perfectly. But naturally. As if they belonged to the same moment. The same place. That evening, I created a note on my phone. Nothing complicated. Just a place to keep the messages together. The list was getting too long to remember. A few days later, another message arrived. He never saw it. That one felt different. The earlier messages described places, doors, lights, entrances. This one described a person. Someone. He never saw it. Who didn't see what? I stared at the sentence for several minutes, then added it beneath the others. For the first time, the list felt less like a collection of messages and more like pieces of a memory. A memory I didn't understand. The next message arrived 5 days later. Too late. That was all. 2 words. Shorter than most of the others. But somehow heavier. Too late. It sounded final. Like something had already happened. Something irreversible. I read it several times before locking my phone. Then unlocked it and read it again. The more messages arrived, the less they felt like random texts. The less they felt like a prank. And the more they felt like records. Notes. Observations. The kind somebody might leave for themselves. Then another message arrived. No one left. I read it twice. Then looked back at the others. Something happened then. Not an answer. A picture. For the briefest moment, I could almost see a scene forming. A building. Lights still on. A front entrance. A side entrance. Someone who missed something. Someone who arrived too late. And someone who never left. The image vanished almost immediately. But it was enough. Enough to convince me that there really was a story hidden inside the fragments. The problem was that I still didn't know whose story it was. Or where it had happened. One night, near the end of my shift, I opened the note on my phone and read everything from the beginning. Not the way the messages had arrived. The way they felt. Grouped together. Connected. That was when I noticed something. The messages never explained anything. They assumed something had already happened. They assumed the reader already knew the beginning. Which meant I was missing more than a few pieces. I was missing the foundation. The event that made all the other messages matter. I leaned back in my chair and looked at the security monitors. The warehouse was quiet. The parking lot was empty. Nothing unusual was happening. But for the first time since this started, I felt certain of something. The messages weren't describing a mystery. They were describing the aftermath of one. And somewhere inside the pieces I hadn't received yet was the reason everything happened in the first place.
Episode 5, The Missing Pieces.
The idea stayed with me for days. The messages weren't describing a mystery. They were describing what came after one. That explained why everything felt incomplete. I wasn't reading the beginning of a story. I was reading the middle. And maybe the end. But the beginning was still missing. That realization changed the way I looked at the messages. I stopped asking what they meant. I started asking what had happened immediately before them. What came before the lights? Before the doors? Before the warning? Before someone was too late? One night, while sitting alone in the security office, I opened the note on my phone and read everything again. Pay attention. Lights were still on. It was already open. Don't use the front. 3. Comma. The side door. He never saw it. Too late. No one left. For the first time, I noticed something else. Almost every message described a detail. A light. A door. A person. A floor. Nobody was expressing emotion. Nobody was panicking. Nobody was asking for help. The messages read like observations. As though someone was documenting a situation. That thought followed me home. And the next message made it worse. 3rd floor. I stared at it for a long moment. Then my eyes moved back to the strange message. 3. Comma. The connection was obvious. Maybe too obvious. But it was the first explanation that actually fit. Not 3 people. Not 3 minutes. 3rd floor. The possibility stayed with me. A few days later another message arrived. Window was open. Then another. Still inside. The list was growing. And with every new fragment, the picture became slightly clearer. Not clearer enough. Just enough to keep me interested. The person behind the messages seemed to be moving through a building. Not describing it. Moving through it. Seeing things. Noting details. Recording observations. The next message arrived on a rainy night. Saw the list. That one stopped me cold. A list. For weeks I'd been wondering about the same thing. The messages kept mentioning people. Now there was a list. The next message arrived only 2 days later. The names were there. I sat back in my chair. Then opened the note again. Saw the list. The names were there. Those two clearly belonged together. More than any messages so far. For the first time, I felt like I was getting close to something real. Not a theory. A real event. A real place. A real person. The next week was frustrating. No messages arrived. The silence returned. But this time it felt different. Because I had enough fragments to start seeing a pattern. A building. A 3rd floor. A side door. A list of names. Someone who wasn't supposed to be there. Someone who missed something important. And somebody recording all of it. The next message arrived after 10 days. Not the first time. I read it twice. Then again. That one changed everything. Because it suggested history. Whatever happened that night wasn't random. It had happened before. Or something similar had. Suddenly the building felt less important than the people inside it. I spent most of that shift staring at the messages. Not reading them. Thinking about them. And then something occurred to me. The messages never sounded like instructions. Even don't use the front. That wasn't a command. It was a note. A reminder. The kind somebody leaves for themselves. I opened the list again. And for the first time, a new idea appeared. What if the messages were never meant to be sent? I sat there staring at the screen. The idea sounded ridiculous. Then less ridiculous. Then strangely reasonable. The broken fragments. The strange timing. The lack of responses. The way my questions never seemed to matter. Maybe the messages weren't part of a conversation at all. Maybe I was finding something. Not receiving it. Finding it. The thought stayed with me for the rest of the night. And by sunrise, I knew one thing. The person behind the messages wasn't trying to talk to me. They were trying to remember something. The question was why. And more importantly, what happened after they finished writing?
Episode 6, The Record.
The idea refused to leave me alone. What if the messages had never been meant to be sent? The more I thought about it, the more sense it made. Whoever wrote them wasn't explaining anything. They weren't introducing people. They weren't providing context. They wrote as if they already knew the story. As if the messages were reminders. Notes. A record. Not communication. Documentation. That changed the way I looked at everything. For weeks, I'd been asking who was sending the messages. Now I started asking who had written them. Those were not the same question. A few days later, another message arrived. She was there. I read it twice. Then added it to the growing list. A woman. For the first time, someone in the story had become more than a vague he. The next message arrived 4 days later. He wasn't on the list. That one stayed with me. Because suddenly the list mattered. Not just as an object. As a clue. There was a list of names. And apparently, one person wasn't supposed to be there. The next message followed 2 days later. She knew his name. I stared at the screen, then looked back at the others. The building. The third floor. The list. The names. The man who wasn't on it. The woman who recognized him anyway. The story was beginning to feel real. Not because I understood it. Because I could imagine it. The next message arrived during a quiet shift. That's when I knew. I sat perfectly still. Knew what? The message never said. But for the first time, I felt certain that something important had happened that night. Not an accident. Not a misunderstanding. A realization. Something had changed. And whoever wrote the messages had noticed it. Over the next week, I spent more time arranging the fragments than I cared to admit. I wasn't trying to solve the mystery anymore. I was trying to understand the person behind it. The messages felt careful. Deliberate. The kind of note someone writes when they are afraid they might forget details later. Then another message arrived. Backup phone. I read it once. Then again. That one changed everything. A backup phone. Suddenly the entire situation made sense in a way it never had before. People don't keep backup phones for ordinary days. They keep them because they expect problems. Because they expect something important. Because they don't trust the main device. I looked back through the messages. The building. The list. The names. The observations. And for the first time, I could imagine the person writing them. Someone moving through a building. Someone documenting what they saw. Someone preserving details. The next message arrived the following night. If anything happens. The sentence ended there. Incomplete. But it didn't need finishing. I already understood. If anything happens. Keep a record. Remember the details. Leave evidence. The thought sent a chill through me. Not because it was frightening. Because it felt real. The final message that month arrived 3 days later. Keep the record. I stared at it for a long time. Then I opened the entire list again. For the first time, I wasn't looking at random fragments. I was looking at preparations. Someone had expected trouble. Someone had documented everything. Someone had taken notes, saved copies, and kept a backup phone. And somehow, years later, pieces of those records were reaching me. That realization answered one question. But it created a much larger one. Because if somebody had gone to all that effort, if they had documented everything, if they had prepared for something to happen, then what happened to them afterward? That question followed me through the rest of the shift. Through the bus ride home. And into the following week. Because I had finally stopped wondering what the messages were. Now I knew. They were a record. The real mystery was the person who left it behind. And for the first time since this all started, I had a feeling the next message might finally tell me what became of them.
Episode 7, someone finally read it.
For months, I'd been asking the wrong question. Who sent the messages? Who owned the number? Who was trying to contact me? By the end, none of those questions mattered. The real question was much simpler. What happened to the person who wrote them? The answer arrived just after 2 a.m. I was sitting alone in the security office when my phone vibrated. Same number. Same conversation. New message. Last entry. I stared at the screen. Then another message appeared. The record was found. A few seconds later. Not by them. Then. By someone else. I leaned forward. For the first time since this all began, the messages weren't fragments. They were a sequence. A conclusion. The next message arrived. She took copies. Then. The original stayed. Then. The list was real. I read them twice. The list. The names. The building. The third floor. Everything suddenly felt much closer. Not because I finally understood it. Because I could finally see where it was leading. Another message appeared. The names mattered. Then. That was the point. He knew they would remove it. That's why he kept records. I sat back in my chair. Months of questions were beginning to collapse into something simpler. The list had never been random. The person writing the messages had been documenting something important. Something worth preserving. Something worth hiding. Then another message arrived. He never came back. I stared at it. The sentence felt heavier than any of the others. A few moments later, another appeared. She did. Then. She kept the record. She kept copies. He expected this. For the first time, I felt like I understood the story. Not every detail. But enough. There had been a man. There had been a woman. Something had happened inside that building. The man never returned. The woman did. And somehow the record survived. The next message appeared. The backup phone was never found. That one explained more than any paragraph could have. The backup phone. The records. The notes. The fragments. The person behind them had expected something to happen. That's why the record existed at all. Then the message arrived that explained the number. The one I'd been waiting for without realizing it. Test route. Never active. I read it twice. Then again. Another message followed. Internal test route. Then. Never used. Then. Never removed. I slowly leaned back in my chair. For months I'd searched for the number. Called it. Researched it. Tried to understand who it belonged to. The answer was simpler than any theory I'd imagined. It didn't belong to anyone. It was never supposed to. The number wasn't a real phone number. It was an abandoned internal route inside an old messaging system. Forgotten. Ignored. Left behind. Then another message appeared. Archive error. Years later. Wrong destination. I stared at the screen. Wrong destination. Me. I wasn't the intended recipient. I wasn't chosen. I wasn't special. A system error had connected me to something that had been sitting unnoticed for years. A forgotten archive. A forgotten record. A forgotten story. And somehow, pieces of it had found their way to me. Then the final messages arrived. One at a time. Slowly. Like the first time. That was enough. The record survived. The truth survived. I waited. The office felt completely silent. Even the warehouse seemed quieter than usual. For a moment, I thought it was over. Then the screen lit up one last time. The final message. The final fragment. I opened it. Someone finally read it. That was all. No goodbye. No explanation. Just that. Someone finally read it. I sat there for a long time looking at the conversation. For months, I'd been trying to understand the person behind the messages. In the end, I think I'd been looking at it the wrong way. The messages were never really about the person. They were about the record. About making sure something wasn't forgotten. Then I looked at the list I'd built over the previous months. The lights. The doors. The names. The third floor. The backup phone. The missing man. The woman who kept the record. Even the strangest message of all. 3. Comma. For months I treated it like a code. A clue. A hidden meaning. In the end, it wasn't. It was exactly what it looked like. A broken fragment. Part of a larger note that hadn't survived intact. Not a mystery. Evidence. And somehow that answer felt more satisfying than any theory I'd invented. The conversation never changed again. No more messages arrived. No final surprises. No hidden ending. Just silence. The difference was that this time, the silence felt complete. A few weeks later, I noticed something strange. I wasn't checking my phone anymore. Not at work. Not on the bus. Not before going to sleep. The habit had disappeared. The mystery was over. And for the first time since that morning on the bus, I understood what had bothered me most. It wasn't the messages. It wasn't the number. It wasn't even the mystery. It was the possibility that something important could exist right in front of us and still go unnoticed. Waiting. Hidden among ordinary things. Waiting for someone to finally pay attention. I still work nights. I still ride the bus home. I still delete old messages. Most mornings look exactly the same. But every now and then, when I'm scrolling through old notifications, I think about that conversation. And I think about the final message. Someone finally read it. Maybe that was the whole point. Not solving the mystery. Not finding the sender. Just making sure the story wasn't forgotten. And somehow, after all those months, that felt like enough.